So welcome everyone. Good morning. It's as you know, it's quite early in the morning, and I appreciate your coming out. So today I'm going to tackle a couple of big ideas. This is IDEASpHERE after all, and there'll be subsidiary ideas scattered throughout, which may or may not be new to you. The two big ideas I'm going to leave you with today are the idea of legitimate coercion and the idea of political negotiation. And first I want to start with the U.S. today and the situation of polarization to situate where these two ideas sit. So this is where the U.S. Congress is today. The dark line is the House, and the gray line is the Senate. And you can see that back in what sometimes is called the Gilded Age, this is the age of all those villas in Newport. At this point, there was very high polarization in Congress. And polarization means that members of one party are not voting with members of the other party. They're only voting with their own party. So very high. And then comes the Depression, people getting together around trying to get out of the Depression. Then comes World War II, and of course the country unites around the war. And then, as we pull out of the war, we have the Eisenhower period, very high partisanship, very low partisanship. That's when you got the interstate highway system and so forth. And then starting around 1964 with the Civil Rights Act, and then later 1980, the polarization is getting higher and higher. And now we have greater polarization than we've had in the last 150 years in the United States. This is where we are now. This only goes up to 2006, but this goes up to 2012. So you can see we're more polarized than we've been for a long time. So why? Well, there's three big reasons and a bunch of subsidiary reasons, but the three structures, and there's a lot of reasons having to do with what's going on in the rules in Congress and so forth, but they're three big underlying reasons. One is the realignment of the parties that those of you who are familiar with U.S. politics will know after the Civil Rights Act in 1964. Another that you might not be quite so familiar with, but as soon as you think, if you're from the U.S., you will remember that the parties have been pretty close electorally. It's been, we haven't known who was going to win the House, who was going to win the Senate since about 1980, and possibly inequality. So I'm going to go through those three causes and give you a little bit of a sense of how to think about them. What happened after 1964 is that in general the Republican Party became more conservative, and the Southern the Democrats became more entirely African American. That is to say, in the South of the United States, the whites left the Democratic Party, and the people who stayed in the Democratic Party were African American, and they were more liberal to begin with. So this is a very complicated graph, but I think when I explain it, it'll be fairly clear. We're talking about here on the left, we're talking about the Republicans in the House and the Democrats in the House. And so here's the 1960, this is the Civil Rights Act. You can see that outside of the South, the this down is more liberal, up is more conservative. So you can see that outside of the South, the Democrats have not gotten that much more liberal. In the South, they have, but it's not that individual people changed from being conservative to being liberal. It's that the whites left and joined the Republican Party, so the people who were left in the Democratic Party became more and more African American. So when you see this line going down, becoming more liberal in the South, that's only because it's not the people changing their minds, it's the composition of the party changing. So basically the Democrats have not changed their politics. Republicans have gotten more conservative. The same thing happens in the Senate, only less so. Again, outside the South, the Democrats have not gotten a great deal more liberal, but the Republicans have gotten more conservative. So that's how we've reached the polarization that I showed you earlier. So that's the realignment of the party story. There's also been a second cause, is that the parties have been very close electorally since 1980. So here's the party composition of the Senate. And you can see, this is 50%, this is control of the Senate. You can see that from 1932 to about 1980, the Democrats were pretty close to kind of just controlling the Senate. There was a little moment here in which the Republicans got control. But by and large, for a very long period of time, if you were a Republican in the Senate, you could expect that the Democrats were in control. Now, what does that do to your strategy? If you're coming in and you're a minority in the minority, and you expect to stay in the minority, the way you get your dams and your bridges, and also the way you get not just those material things, but the way you get a sort of seat at the table to talk about the real issues of the country, where we should be going, how to do regulation, is you're not too obstreperous. The Democrats have control, so you don't make too many waves. You get your ideas on the table, you get your dams, you get your bridges, you are part of the dialogue, but you don't try, for example, to filibuster too much, except in, on civil rights issues. The Democrats were civil, the Republicans didn't do that much filibustering. You basically kind of go along to get along. Now, as the Republican Party gets to more power in the country and begins to get very close to being able to control the Senate, the strategy changes for both parties. If you're very tight electorally, your strategy, a perfectly reasonable strategy, would be to keep the other party from making any wins while they're in power. Because then you could go to the voters and say, look, they didn't do a darn thing. So vote for us, we're going to do something. So you want to keep the party in power, whether you're a Democrat or a Republican, from doing anything. So you start to find the beginning, you start to find polarization increasing a lot, because the parties are now at loggerheads. They're now seeing each other as enemies, and you don't go along to get along. This, of course, is more true with the Republican Party, which has become more conservative. And also, there are more things. The Democrats are essentially the party of change. The Republicans, this is not a full description, because there are many changes the Republicans want as well. But by and large, if you're stopping things, that's going to be a little bit more to the advantage of the Republicans than the Democrats. So this period is a period of high contest in which your strategy as a minority member changes. Instead of going along to get along, you try to stop the opposite party. And this is just it's happened a little later in the House, but it's the same thing. So, essential Democratic dominance for a long time, and then a period of high contest. So those are two deeply structural things that are going on in the parties today in the U.S. And then there's a structural cause that I've put a question mark after, because I'll show you. Here is polarization, the same picture you saw before in gray. And here is the top income share, the top 1%, the percentage of income it has in the United States. So it had a lot of the income back here in the days of the robber barons and the Gilded Age, and also now. And then during the war, first of all during the Depression, and then during the war taxes were continued by Eisenhower to do things like the interstate highway, all that. But now those things are just almost eerily parallel. It looks as if there must be some kind of causation. But coming up with a mechanism for that causation is a little bit difficult. Some people have said, well, if you're rich, you can buy, you can get politicians to agree with your principles by supporting their campaigns and so forth, and you can stop any redistribution, and so you are able to keep any attempts at spending anything from happening, and so you block lots and lots of legislation. But then, as you go into war and you lose your as much of your money, you can't sort of buy as much in the politics, and therefore you kind of retreat from being able to buy people, and then the politicians redistribute, and because they redistribute, then more people at the bottom have money, and so you can kind of tell a story like that. But there's one problem, which is that in time, the polarization seems to come before the inequality. In other words, to have that story happen, you'd have to have people get the money and then block the process. Get the money and block the process. But now it may be that the measurements are a little wrong, and if you measured this better, you'd be able to see it happening here, and if you measured this better, you'd be seeing. All I'm saying is, we don't know. Political science, I've just been president of the American Political Science Association for a year. We did a report on this, and there's some people who are convinced, because it's pretty hard not to be convinced that there's, if you look at that there's not some sort of causal relation. But it's pretty hard. No one's come up with the smoking guns. Nobody's been able to figure out actually what the mechanisms are. So that's why I have a question mark after inequality. It might be a driver. But let's take a look at these three. Are they going to change? Not tomorrow. So people who, and I'm one of them, who are part of do-good groups to try to go to members of Congress and say, try to be nicer and be more civil and all this, we're facing some very, very deep underlying structural factors that make those kinds of things look as if you're dancing on the top of the water. Now there have been a whole lot of suggestions, but it looks, from a political science point of view, it looks as if these things probably don't have a huge effect. One big thing that I'm in favor of, because I'm a Democrat, just I'm not capital D Democrat, which I also happen to be, but also a small d Democrat, is nonpartisan redistricting committees. We know both the Democrats and the Republicans, capital D, capital R, are very in favor of being in charge of their own districting, because everybody who's gotten into any office got into it through the district that they're in, and they don't want to change that. Thank you very much. But if we were to have nonpartisan commissions that drew district lines on the basis of some sort of common sense, we might be able to, well, that would be good for democracy. But would it change polarization? Just think about the Senate. The Senate is a district that you can't change. The Senate's been its district for a very long time, and it's polarized. You remember that graph? It polarized just along with the House. So it can't be affected by districting. They're also at-large districts in various places in the United States, the way the states have worked it. And they are not drawn in a gerrymandered way. And they've also polarized. And then some political science has experimented with randomized districts that don't exist. They've created the kinds of districts that are nonpartisan on their computers. They've created those kinds of districts, and then they've seen what kinds of people they would elect, and they're polarized too. So this is probably a good democratic reform, but it's probably not going to affect polarization a whole ton. Another democratic reform is to open primaries, and that might do a little bit. But we can see that once primaries were introduced, if you look at the history, when primaries were introduced, it didn't polarize the system. When various primaries have been opened in the different states, the system continued to polarize. The one example of success in opening primaries is that in California, just recently, when they created an open primary system, it did reduce polarization, and where it reduced polarization was in the competitive districts. In other words, when you had Democrats and Republicans competing for the seat, they would aim at the median voter. They would aim at the person in the middle. But in the districts that weren't competitive, that were all Republican or all Democrat, they were just as polarized as ever. And guess what? With people moving to live with people that are like them these days, the districts are getting less and less competitive. They're getting more and more homogeneous. And the polarization kept on going in the homogeneous districts. So this is an answer, but not much of an answer. It's not going to solve the problem by any manner of means. Now there is a reform that might well have some impact, because here, take a look at the percentage of out-of-district contributions over time. They've gone, that means that in any given district where people are running for office, the huge percentage of contributions to people's campaigns are from out of district. Why would you invest if you were out of district? You invest in this race because you have an ideology. Who are the people who are going to take money out of their pocket that they could have spent on other things and send it to a district they don't even live in? It's going to be people who care a lot. What position do people take who care a lot on this political spectrum? They're more at the extreme. So these people who are sending out-of-district contributions are more and more tend to be at the extreme. So they're going to be looking for polarized candidates. They're going to be looking for candidates more at the extreme to support. And here is the concentration of income and campaign contributions in the top 0.01% of households. So this tracks the share of the campaign contributions in all federal elections donated by the top 0.01% of the voting age population. And you can see since 1980, it has gone way, way, way up. In other words, the very, very rich are contributing a lot more to the political system. So this is the puzzle you have. But are we likely to be able to break the back of that cause? It will probably take a constitutional amendment. And I was involved in the constitutional amendment to try to get an equal rights amendment to the Constitution of the United States. And I can tell you it's pretty hard to get a constitutional amendment. You need supermajorities in the House and the Senate. You also need supermajorities in the states. It's very hard to get a constitutional amendment. So it's quite possible that the polarization that we saw at the very beginning on that very first graph is the new normal. It's what we're going to have to live with because of these very deep structural factors. Don't mean to say they're not going to change in 20 years or possibly 30 years, because some of those causes, the realignment of the parties, something could happen in the parties that would cause them to break apart. The competitiveness, one of the parties could draw permanently ahead, and after 10 or 15 or more years, the other party would say, okay, this is going to be, we can perceive this party being dominant for a long time, we're going to start going along to getting, or we could change the inequality. But almost every post-industrial country is getting more unequal as we speak. So these are very deep structural causes. Well, what do we do? Let me tell you about the voters, meanwhile. This is being driven by voters. The answer in political science is basically not so much. It is true that voters now are more polarized. For example, party identifiers say, people who identify as Republican or Democrat, say they dislike the other party, people in the other party more than they did a generation ago. And they're also less likely to feel comfortable with their child marrying somebody from another party. It's a wonderful question. It's been repeated over time with quite strong results. Well, then maybe the dynamic is that the voters are polarizing and changing but we don't think so. we think that a lot of these findings reflect what's called voter sorting. Not that the voters' policy preferences have become more polarized. Voter policy preferences tend to be in the middle. But just think of your own life, or, you know, some of you are my age, but most of you are younger. But at any rate, think back. In the old days, if your son married a Democrat and you were a conservative, you might say, well, what kind of Democrat? And if you were, let's say, culturally conservative and they said a Southern Democrat, you'd say, oh, well, that's okay, you know. Or if your daughter were marrying a Republican, you'd say, well, what kind of Republican? And if you were a Democrat and they said a liberal Republican from the East, you'd say, well, that's okay. Now, with the parties polarizing, there aren't those different kinds of Democrats, there aren't those different kinds of Republicans. So the voters take a look at these polarized parties and have to choose. And they think of all Democrats as one kind of person. They think of all Republicans as another kind of person because of what the party's done. So that's the theory, that it doesn't start with the parties, it doesn't start with the voters polarizing and then the parties follow suit, but rather it starts with the parties polarizing for their own reasons, and you saw the reasons earlier, and then the voters follow suit. And then we have another structural problem, which is the US Constitution. And the framers built a lot of separation of powers into the US system. Indeed, the US system is the system with the most separation of powers of pretty much any, well, of any advanced industrial democracy. And the theory was a pretty simple theory, which was if you put in all these veto points, then all these demands that are not absolutely for sure for the common good are going to be stopped by the veto points, and only the purest, most wonderful, fabulous common good will be able to come out through all those veto points and succeed, and you won't have any kind of tyranny. And so they were really, really worried about tyranny, and not so worried about doing a whole lot of legislation, because you didn't need a great deal of legislation back then. So you've got all these structural features in a system that's designed to block legislation. You've got polarization in a system that's designed to block legislation. So what's going to change? Are the parties going to realign? Are they going to stop being electorally close? Is inequality going to stop? Are people going to stop moving to places where other people are like them? Because people now are rich enough to be able to move for that kind of reason, not so much just because their job is there anymore. And constitutional separation of powers. My estimate is that those things aren't going to change soon, and that this is therefore the new normal. So what do we do? Let's stop here, because I'm basically dividing this into 3 parts, and this is the end of the polarization part. And so I'd like to kind of see if there's anybody who wants to kind of comment on these causes of polarization, or ask questions or anything like that before I go on to you know, what we might be able to do about it. Yes?
So just on the campaign finance, so I'm a dual citizen, but I live in Canada, and so I follow American politics closely, Canadian politics, I'm quite involved in Canada. But it seems to me that the big issue is campaign finance reform. In Canada, everyone's fighting for the center. We have a Liberal Party, a Conservative Party, and Social Democrat. But no one's allowed to spend more than $1,000.
Can everybody hear me?
No corporate or union donations at all in any campaigns. Everyone's fighting for the center.
Yes.
So whatever it's going to take constitutionally, it seems to me, and because the rest of the world is deeply impacted by U.S. policy, it seems to me it's worth a shot.
Yeah,
it seems
absolutely.
To be
that
real
is
problem.
the old, you know, that's what the sort of median voter theorem. There was originally a guy named Hotelling who said, okay, why are, if there are 2 shoe stores on Main Street, why are they both in the middle? He was an economist, and he was really only looking at the spatial distribution of stores. Haven't you ever noticed that sort of the shoe stores? Well, he says, okay, so if you have just a slight difference between these 2, all the people on this side of the street are going to, on this part of the, are going to go to this one, all the people are going to go. If one of these moved here, then they'd lose those people. So there's a, so you would see that there's a, they have an incentive, an economic incentive to move close and capture. And he said, and then Anthony Downs came along, and the same thing's true with parties. That they have, that if you have nothing standing in the way, like the funding by extremists of the political process, they're going to aim at the median voter, just what you say they do in Canada. They're going to, all the parties are going to try to go for the middle. But as you know, it takes a constitutional amendment or a very deep change in the composition of the Supreme Court for that to happen. The composition of the Supreme Court happens very slowly. Constitutional amendments we've designed to, it's harder to change a constitutional the Constitution in the U.S. than in almost every other country. So
that's what's required for campaign finance reform?
I beg your pardon? That's what's required for campaign finance reform, because the Supreme Court has said that restrictions on campaign finance is like a restriction on speech, because as I give money, it's a way of expressing my political views. So you would need a constitutional amendment, or else a change in the Supreme Court that would make them go against all their past precedents to do this.
Can you speak a little bit to those who have chosen no party and have declared themselves independents?
Yes. In the United States, we've structured it very much so that it favors a two-party system. It's very hard for anybody who comes up on an independent party to succeed, because they become a spoiler in the system. If they take away from the Republican votes, then the Democrats win. If they take away from the Democratic votes, the Republicans win. And you know, Nader was an example. You know, so this is not just imaginary. This is real. The importance of not now. Way we have used to get around this before, for the recent era, was that parties invented something called fusion parties. So Nader, for example, could run as an independent or green, but run together with the Democrats, so that votes would be pooled and you'd elect a presidential candidate. You wouldn't lose your vote. Most states have made laws against fusion. So, and the Supreme Court has not told the states they can't do that. So that's a very technical answer to a broader question. The broader question is that in the U.S. it's very, very difficult to set up a third party. It does. The system is structured to make that almost impossible.
Has anyone offered like a rank voting, like your first choice or second choice?
Yeah, rank voting. You can. Cambridge has rank voting. It's called the single transferable vote. There are other forms of rank voting, and there are a couple of forms. Rank voting tends to be more moderate. Why? That's because if I'm running for office and I think I might not get an absolute majority because there's quite a broad field, then I won't be too extreme, because I'm trying to get, just in case I don't get a majority, I want those number 2 votes. So I don't want to alienate any of the people who might vote for me, but who are actually voting for someone else. It doesn't mean that I'm trying to get the votes of people who are absolutely opposite me, but it means that I'm trying, the rank voting means that it's, you get more than one choice, that spreads it out. It means that people are less likely to get a majority. It means that, so therefore, they're going to be aiming at moderating. And the people who study elections know this. Yes.
Just a comment on the campaign finance reform, because it would seem like it would be a panacea, and yes, if we could only have that.
Yeah.
But we know that's not the case, because we've seen public financing in states, and even when that's happened, the state courts have overturned it. So even if we had a change on the Supreme Court, it hasn't necessarily worked. I come from Connecticut. We tried it there.
Right, because states have their own constitutions.
Yeah, so given that we already have this system,
But I think
though,
probably if one could get a US constitutional amendment, the very process of deliberation might well change some of the state constitutions too. But it wouldn't, not only would it not be, some of those other factors are going on. You know, I mean, in other words, this is a deep problem. So it's definitely not a panacea. Absolutely not. You're completely right. This is just one thing that could do some good. Some people have come in late, so.
can I just finish the
yeah,
comment though, because I would love to see it work. So I would
Yeah.
love to see what that would look like. You know, what the suggestion would be, because I think if you ask people, they do it on tax returns, contribute $1. Some people do that. Others are like, are you kidding? I'm not going to dare give money to the Republican Party. I don't want my taxes going towards, you know, another party that I don't like or a candidate that I don't like.
The
So-
thing on the tax, you get to give it to the party of your choice.
Right, but so a bigger system, like what would your campaign finance reform
Right.
look like? Because
Yeah.
PAC reform didn't work. We now have super PACs. I mean, anytime it's like squeezing the toothpaste. It's the money's gonna come out of the system somewhere.
Right.
So
All
what
the
would your
tax reform that's
system look
happened
like?
so far has happened within the constraints of the Supreme Court, which started with Buckley v. DeLeo. So if you had actually a constitutional amendment, there would be a chance for much more sweeping campaign finance reform, such as the kind you have in Canada or in Europe. And when you have, if you're looking for an example of what would it look like, the thing to do is to look outside the United States for examples, because we have been so constrained by the Supreme Court for a very long time that anything that's been done has been done within the Supreme Court restrictions. Let's see. Let's do one more, and then I think maybe I'm going to skip some of the stuff that I was going to do before. After. Go ahead.
I was just curious if you could elaborate a little bit more on the correlation between inequality and polarization, and I was curious as to why you think the causal relationship is that inequality causes polarization and not the other way around. I assume you've tested that, but I was just wondering if you could.
Yeah. Okay, I'm going in the wrong direction, sorry. No, I don't. I think I was trying to be quite neutral about my understanding of this. What I was trying to say was, I don't have an explanation for this pattern. I suggested one explanation, but I think I tried to say quite explicitly that I didn't think that caused the whole pattern. And I think in political science we don't have an explanation for this. So that's why I put a question mark after inequality, was because I'm not sure that it's just you look at this pattern and you think, well, maybe there's some kind of correlation there. I mean, maybe there's some kind of, there's obvious correlation, there's a fantastic correlation. Maybe there's some sort of causation, but we don't know. You're quite right. I mean, and I tried to be clear about that. We don't know about the causality, and if you're looking at the causality here, the actual polarization happens before, in time, the inequality. So the idea that the inequality causes it may be that these are measured wrong, but basically we're head scratching. How do you get this extraordinary correlation? So let's see. I think maybe I will go on to some of my the next big item, but I won't do the little class exercise that I was going to do, and I'll just tell you how it might come out. So legitimate coercion. And some of you, people who've been at the Kennedy School, probably know what a free rider problem is, sometimes called the collective action problem. And it's created by a free access good. I'll explain what these things are in a minute, which is sometimes called a non-excludable good. And what is a free access good? I'll explain. A free access good is something that once I produce, or once somebody or other produces it, everybody can use it, whether or not they've contributed to building it or creating it in some way. So if you, for example, think of a road, if some of us build a road and anybody can use it, that's a free access good. Some of us defend the country and the country's now at peace, that's a free access good. And the thing about free access goods is that it naturally behooves everybody, from the point of view of their self-interest, to use it but not pay for it. But if nobody pays for it, then it doesn't get built. So the example I want to use is, maybe I can do this. Everybody's got possibly a piece of paper. I'm just going to, if you don't, just tear a piece of paper in half and give the half to your neighbor, or half a piece of paper. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to bless you all with $100 in your pocket. You've got $100 in your pocket, an imaginary $100, and I want you to write, give me either that whole $100 or zero, nothing in between, just to keep it simple. So you're going to write on that piece of paper either zero or $100, you're going to give it to me. Then what I'm going to do is I'm going to double it. I'm going to take everything I get, double it, and hand it back equally. So if everybody in this class gives me, in this room gives me $100, then everybody will get back $200, because without any effort on your part, I'm just a doubling tree. Okay? But of course, it pays every person to keep their $100. So give me zero, then what you'll do is you'll still have your $100, but you'll have your equal part of what everybody else has handed in, doubled and returned to you. So that if you don't hand in the $100, if you hand in zero, you'll walk out with your $100.
We should probably all discuss this.
Plus, but you already discussed this, fine. Good, well this is very, very critical. So now would everybody, if any questions on the sort of logic, it's a very simple logic. It was invented in the 1950s by 3 different groups, which I can tell you in a second. So everybody please write $0 or $100, fold over your paper so nobody can see what you've written, and hand it up to our friend here in the, at the end. Now this logic is a logic that was not understood. It's a little bit like supply and demand. It was a logic that had to be discovered, and it was not discovered until the early 50s by 3 different groups of people. People in finance, and people in people in fisheries. And people in game theory, people in finance, and people in fisheries. Also, Paul Samuelson was one of the people who began to sort of understand this. They all came together, and now, okay. So what do? You can imagine that in a society, and we'll find out how much you contribute in a minute, but I bet it's about maybe somewhere between 60 or 80%. A society where 60 or 80% contribute is going to do less well than a society where 100% contribute, because here's this mechanism that just automatically doubles things. How do you get people to contribute? Let's say it's taxes that you're getting people to contribute. Well, you institute a little bit of coercion. You say, if you don't pay your taxes, you'll be fined, or in the worst case, you'll be sent to jail. So we create that piece of coercion, which gets people to give in their $100. But that coercion works best if it's legitimate. What do I mean by legitimate? There's coercion. What I mean by coercion is the threat of sanction to the use of force. That is, say, if you don't do it, we'll put you in jail, or I force you to do it. By legitimate, I just mean that it's rightful. So how does the coercion become rightful? Well, suppose we all vote. We could all vote to have some kind of punishment for the people who didn't hand in their $100, and then we'd say, well, that was a legitimate vote. We were giving a law to ourselves, and so people would not only then pay their $100 not only because they're afraid that they'll be put in jail or whatever, but they'll also pay it because they know it was rightfully voted upon. It's legitimate coercion. So the problem is created by a free access good. This problem only arises when you have these particular kinds of goods that are free access goods. So you want to look around the world and say, what's a free access good? Global warming, or the reduction of global warming is a free access good. Whenever you see a free access good, picking up litter on the street, whenever you see a free access good, you've got to either, if you live in a small enough society, generate enough altruism and solidarity to solve it, to make people just give in their $100, or you have to have some legitimate coercion. The more anonymous the society, the larger the society, the more likely you're going to you have to use some coercion. So whenever you see a free access good, and you should be thinking in your lives, what's a free access good? For example, if you live in a commune, dishes in the cupboard, clean dishes in the cupboard are a free access good. People who leave the dirty dishes in the sink, they're breaking the norms. They should be washing them, putting them in the cupboard. Then the cupboard, it becomes a free access good. There are millions of thousands, hundreds of thousands of free access goods in our world, and as we become more and more interdependent, not only from a climate perspective, but also from a needs, a desires perspective, we have blueberries on our table in winter these days. How many free access goods are required to get those blueberries on our table? You have to have, in Chile, you have to have plant safety regulations. You have to have roads. You have to have ports. You have to have ships and airplanes. You have to have emissions standards, etc. When you get here, there have to be safety standards in the stores and so forth. Thousands of free access goods required to get blueberries. We didn't used to have blueberries on our tables in winter. Now we want them. We can get them, but to get them, we need a lot of free access goods, which means we need more. What percentage?
All right, so 68% people gave $100.
68%.
Yep.
Not bad.
And
Very good. Not as good as happened in the American Political Science Association when I was president and gave my presidential address. But they were friends of Jenny. 68% is pretty good, but it's not 100%, right? And how many dollars would people who gave?
So everyone would get $136.
$136.
Yep.
So those who gave in their 100 would walk out with 136, and those who didn't would walk out with 236. If we did this a second time, some of those people who gave 100 would move over to 0. Because they'd say, the person next to me walked out with 236. And then if we did it a third time, even fewer would give in 100. And you know what? Those dollars were imaginary. If I made them real, that number would really plummet. And then if I made it 1,000, that number would plummet. So this is an example of why you need legitimate coercion. And our major way of getting legitimate coercion has been democracy and majority rule. Once kings and so forth became cool. But in a polarized system, majority rule isn't going to work very well because we've got a polarized system with all these veto points in it. So I'm going to introduce the concept of political negotiation. And I'm going to skip the questions and comments here. So this is the second big idea. And I'm now going to take, some of you who were at the Kennedy School may have taken courses in negotiation. We've had about 40 years worth of study on individual negotiation. All of those courses, all of those textbooks, all of that work is telling you how to be a better negotiator individually. We've had essentially zero work on how to design institutions so that they facilitate negotiation. And that's what I did in my last year as president of the American Political Science Association. I tried to bring in negotiation to political science to ask us to start thinking about what institutions facilitate negotiation. So if you have ever taken one of those courses, you'll know that two of the, this is how you define a negotiation. If there's a deal to be made, you make it. And you might not make it because you get mad and all that, but there's a deal to be made if you make it. And then also, if there's a way that you can expand the pie and bring in more issues, create value, you do that. And I'm going to show you what that means. Oops. So let's take the example of someone who wants to sell a gas station. But they will not sell it for less than $500,000. It just doesn't make sense. And there's somebody who wants to buy a gas station, but they can't afford to pay more than $400,000. So no deal, right? No what's called zone of possible agreement. This is just not possible. But in the case, this is, they're given this sort of negotiation case, it turns out that the person who's selling the station wants to go on a trip, wants to come back, and when they come back, they want a job. So if the buyer figures that out, the buyer offers the seller a job when the seller comes back. And the seller is now willing to sell for $495,000 plus a job. That package makes sense to the seller. Now, when that case was given to business school students, they were told to make a deal, only 39% of them were able to make that deal. But then they were given, just another group was given exactly the same, randomized group was given the instructions to take the perspective of the other in the negotiation. Try to understand what the other person's thinking. His interests and purposes in selling the station. Try to imagine what you were thinking in that role. This is simple, how many sentences? Two sentences. Those 2 sentences changed the percentage of making the deal from 39% to 76%. Because by doing that, they began to see, well, wait a minute, he has an interest in a job, and maybe I can blah, 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 blah. So they thought that through. How do you do that? Those people, this is like the Congress. These people are not trying to find a common ground for the good of the country. All they want is something that's good for me. They're not interested in the good of the country. They're just interested. How do you get that? You get it by adding issues. That's a big thing you can do. In the gas station example, you bring in the job as another issue. Because on the simple issue of price, no deal. As Barney Frank puts it, that's what happens in Congress. Congress has access to lots and lots of issues. They can create packages that are much more easily than you can in commerce. Also, you have repeated interaction. So you begin to see, you might, in this case you only had the one case, but you understand, you talk to your Republican friend, you talk to your Democratic friend, you begin to understand what their district needs, what their party needs. You're able to figure out how to produce wins for them. And that repeated interaction lets you see things from the other's perspective. And you get together on the golf course, you get together in closed rooms. As soon as you get in public, people are grandstanding. They're not talking about what their real issues are. So these are some of the things that let you achieve this kind of negotiation in which you put more issues on the table and are able to see how to make a deal that's better. What interferes with it? Coming into the negotiation with thinking fixed pie and self-serving bias. I'm going to skip these biases. Well, we'll just pretty quickly maybe. Self-serving bias. About more than half of the people in the country think that they're better than average drivers. And more than half of the people in the country think that they produce more on their workplace than their co-workers. And more than half of the people in the country think they have managerial prowess that is greater than average. That's the human beings. We're wonderful. We're over-optimistic about ourselves. That's what leads us to go try to do things. In a negotiation, it's very problematic. Because like, you remember Karl Rove in the last election, he truly believed that the polls that the reporters were reporting were wrong. Because he was optimistic. And it's wonderful to be optimistic. But when you enter into a negotiation by being more optimistic than you should be about the prospects for success, both sides doing that, they're less likely to achieve a negotiation. So how do you reduce self-serving bias? Well, you do pretty much the same thing as with the other. You facilitate repeated interaction, you provide privacy and informality, because once you get together with your Republican friend, your Democratic friend, you begin to see, they see it from a different perspective. They have other facts that balance your facts. My gosh. And also you create nonpartisan fact-finding bodies like the Congressional Budget Office, because then if you can agree on the facts, your negotiation is way, way facilitated. So, we've got warring parties now. I believe that's the new normal. Warring parties aren't that different from a buyer and seller in the market. There are many times in which there are negotiations that can be done that will actually make both better off. You don't have to be sort of nice and compromise. You can be only out for your party. But you have to think clearly about what your interests really are. You have to think what your party really wants. You have to think what your district really wants. And the chances are fairly strong that you can produce you can use political negotiation. So if you go out there talking to your friends and people are lamenting the state of polarization in the US today, I bet your friends are saying we really need to compromise. And that's true. That is true, we need to compromise. But in addition, we need to understand negotiation, and we need to tell the members of Congress that they need to negotiate, and we actually need to train them in the skills of negotiation. So they walk in with their interests absolutely clear, they understand their interests, they understand the other people's interests, and they can cut a deal based on that. So to produce legitimate coercion, we need to get to yes in politics, and that's the way, oops, sorry, I'm going backwards. Because yes, we need political negotiation. So can political negotiation help? I think so. It accepts fundamental conflict, but it produces agreement. So it makes legitimate coercion possible. So if that's the new normal, I think we've got to think a lot more about negotiation. That's what I have to say to you guys. Thank you. We could do a little bit of questions now because, you know, on the grounds we started late, right? So why can't we go late? Yes.
What factor do you see in that of the what I call the rise of the political insider? You know, I mean, insider. So, you know, politics is like sports now, you've got commentary programs, I mean, all of these things are built around, and you've got an inside group who will like and share everything on Facebook, and but they are even more partisan than the people they vote for.
That's true. Well, there are two things going on there. One is the internet and increasing narrowcasting. The fact that people are only speaking with one another, and that's with the people who like them. And that's been demonstrated. And that's technology for you. And that's another of these factors that I only went to the top 3, but that's another important factor which is not going to go away. It's also true that the media have become more and more likely to report on the horse race than on the actual substance of what people said. Tom Patterson here at the Kennedy School has got data on newspapers and television shows over time showing that the amount of time given to the candidates' own words, the candidates want to talk about policy. If you look at what the candidates say, they say, I'm for this, I'm for that, I'm for the other thing, I want to do these things. That's reported less and less, and what's reported is the manager of so-and-so says that, you know, in Dakota, they're going, oh, and, you know, if they run this ad and they run that ad, and people are following it like sports. Those things we're stuck with. I don't see any way around them.
I'm thinking in history, particularly of Lyndon Johnson.
Lyndon Johnson.
And he was a master, one could argue, at negotiation as described. Yeah. However, you use the term legitimate coercion. I'm thinking that Lyndon Johnson used illegitimate coercion, and what I'm trying to draw the parallel is that Johnson forced people to the negotiation table. It's that infamous picture of him nose to nose with Senator Russell, and you could tell he was just physically bullying him, representative of his style. Today, we don't seem to, certainly don't have that style of forcing you to negotiation. So how do we get to that point of negotiation, lacking that type of aggressive leader, and I'm just coining a phrase and I apologize, of using illegitimate coercion to get you to the negotiation table? Yeah,
that's a great question. Don't forget that Johnson was the one who signed the Civil Rights Act,
that's right,
who created which created the realignment. So he was living in a situation in which he could use the coercion of the fact that the Democratic Party was was very powerful. You remember my graph of the Senate and the House that showed that the Democratic Party was in control at that time
That's right.
of the Senate and the House. So he had this coercion which was legitimate in one sense, which was that it came out of the voters voting the Democratic Party a majority. And that's what he was using. He wasn't saying, I'll send you to jail. He was saying, we're the majority, and if you want, you know, X, Y, Z, come along with us. Now he also, as you know, everybody's, you know, the picture of Johnson leaning over people, he did use his height and his sort of inner bully to bully people. But Russell was one of his best friends. If any of you are ever in Austin, Texas, I completely recommend going to the Johnson Library. You think Johnson Library, boring library, but in it are a lot of telephones. And if you pick up the telephone, it's called Mr. President, the President is on the line. And you hear Johnson talking to someone, Jacqueline Kennedy, after Kennedy was killed. You hear him talking to Russell and saying, well, Russell, I really need you to be on this. And Russell says, I can't do it, I can't do it. He says, I really need it, I really need it. Russell says, I can't do it, I can't do it. And Johnson says, well, I'm sorry about that because I told the press you were going to be on it, you know, just now. and it's just amazing to hear the voice, you know, I mean, you really get that sense. And but Russell was his friend. You can do that. You can use that kind of bullying in a sense with a friend. So it's a really complex question, but I would say that most of Johnson's, 90% or 95 or 98% of Johnson's bullying was a legitimate form of coercion and that it came out of a majority.
Thank you.
Yes?
The polarization that we have now, is it in fact unprecedented, or was there a prior time in our history where it was like this? And secondly, what do you see, or how do you see this polarization ending?
I don't see it ending. This is the prior time that it was almost as high as it is now. The time of the villas in Newport, the Gilded Age, the robber barons. Polarization was almost as high as it is now. Before this, our measures are not super accurate, but it may be that we're more polarized than ever before. One more question, because then I should let you go.
Doesn't when parties come together and negotiate, doesn't negotiation favor the party that has more to lose if they don't negotiate?
Yes.
Say, you were
Yes,
saying,
it does.
you were saying earlier that
Any negotiation favors the
you were
party that
saying
has
that
more to lose.
conservatives in general tend not to want to negotiate because they're conservative.
Absolutely. The party of the status quo is always benefited in negotiations.
So how are you
If the negotiation falls apart, then
So how are you supposed to negotiate with somebody that?
you can't. You can't. No. I'm talking not about what are called intractable problems, where the parties actually there is no deal to be had. One party just prefers, for very strategic reasons, to block everything. But there are more. All I'm saying is that we know from negotiation literature, that there are many, many, many more instances of times when you can make a deal than times when the deal is made. And so it's that gap I want to narrow, not to bring into negotiation things that are not negotiable. If one party wins by not negotiating, then there's no deal to be made, and that's life, and that will take the party of the status quo. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Hope you have a wonderful time.